It's the question that must keep Shuntaro Furukawa up in a cold sweat on even the muggiest Tokyo night. What if the Switch successor fails? In this video, we're going to look at what has caused previous Nintendo consoles to fail and which lessons can be drawn as a result, what the prevailing market conditions are that could go against Nintendo, and we're going to analyse what the worst case scenario could look like for Nintendo's next system. First then, let's look back and see which Nintendo consoles in the past were successes or failures, which ones just bobbled in the middle, and what the commonalities were. I think the successes are fairly clear to see. The original Famicom, the Wii, at least for its first few years, and the Nintendo Switch clearly blew away the competition. On the handheld front, the Game Boy and DS were also great successes. What do all these successful consoles have in common? I would say firstly, they were all major leaps forward, not necessarily in technical capacity, but certainly in concept. They were clear blue ocean devices and entered into the market as disruptive forces. Then we get to the second division, consoles which did very well, but in all cases were scuppered by one key weakness. In the case of the Super NES, I think there's a fair case that Nintendo did everything more or less right. A concept that progressed gaming but didn't rock the boat too much, a great suite of games, and of course they supported the Super NES for a fair time. However, two things did for the 16-bit marvel. Firstly, they had real competition in the home console space for the first time from Sega's upstart system, which had reached Japan a year earlier and had commanded a decent head start. This head start was consolidated in the international markets with Sega's much beefier games lineup. Out went milquetoast mascot Alex Kidd, in came aggressively blue Sonic the Hedgehog, a strong rival mascot amid a suite of generally great 16-bit games on the Mega Drive or Genesis, meaning that Nintendo could not claim the full dominance it had achieved more or less by default in the mid-80s. Furthermore, this was the era of emergent 3D technology, and there was a strong move to replace the system with the kind of polygonal power that was coming to the fore in the arcades, which meant that in the last year of the Super Nintendo's life, it was competing not just with the Mega Drive, but with the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. Then there is the 3DS, where the fault lay not within Nintendo's stars, but within themselves. What people remember is that Nintendo priced the system too highly out of the gate and needed to pull the price back down. And the 3DS was substantially more expensive than any previous console, and inflation adjusted was practically the same price as a GameCube, something I explored in this video that is on screen at the moment. However, the side of the ledger that I think is underappreciated is the lack of really strong games early on. Switch had Breath of the Wild and Mario Kart 8, followed soon by Splatoon 2. The Super NES had Super Mario World, the N64 had Super Mario 64. The 3DS spent its first 8 months on the market, mostly held up by sequels such as Nintendogs and Cats, and remakes such as Star Fox 64 3D and Ocarina of Time 3D. Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7 were coming over the horizon, but not until the 3DS had experienced a fairly rocky launch calendar year, arriving as they did in the holiday period. Okay, you might argue that this was the GBA playbook and that worked out okay, but even the good old Game Boy Advance had a Mario Kart game immediately after launch to plump up the launch lineup. Heck, the major handheld franchise Pokemon was still, in a move humiliating for the 3DS, releasing major DS titles such as Black 2 and White 2 over a year into the life of the tri-dimensional successor. Basically, I think both the game lineup and the price have to take responsibility jointly for the 3DS's early stumble, but let's not forget that the system actually in the end did pretty well. It was supported with first-party offerings for over a year, was being sold for nigh on a full decade, and it was responsible for a bunch of franchises hitting an even bigger high than before, including Luigi's Mansion and Animal Crossing, as well as the mysteriously quiet of late Tomodachi Life. Also, while the price was a concern, they needed to correct for, in some respects, the low launch price of the N64 and GameCube did not help those systems to thrive. Many people at the launch of the Switch were skeptical that they could go above $250. My point is that, while price is important, I suspect that demand for the Switch successor, in the very early days at least, will be, as the economic terminology goes, fairly price inelastic. That is to say, there is a huge groundswell of people who want it and will push themselves to pay even a higher price, which may give Nintendo a little more leeway to charge more, at least for the first several months. Still, we will look at price again in a minute, but let's move on to the king of the second division consoles. The consoles that didn't quite go stratospheric, but only because of one or two key flaws. And the king has to be the Game Boy Advance, whose 81.51 million lifetime sales may seem small compared to the DS, but only disguise the fact that it was only Nintendo's premier handheld device for barely over 3 years. Actually, its sales success was phenomenal for this period, and if anybody wants a model console to demonstrate how an iterative Switch successor could look, the dear old GBA is certainly an incredibly strong case in point. If the DS had not come along in the GBA's prime, it is likely that the Game Boy Advance would have continued to thrive for a good while longer, but the developers wanted to go in a new and experimental direction, and so the DS was issued as a third-prong system. Now sometimes, though, these Blue Ocean and particularly third-prong systems go badly wrong. The Virtual Boy may be infamous, but it was clearly a dramatic failure at the time as well. Introduced towards what would normally have been the late stage of the Game Boy's life, after it had experienced 6 years on the market, it clearly failed on every level and was soon discontinued. Then there is the infamous case of the Wii U, a console that was Blue Ocean on concept and even on innovative titles like Splatoon and Mario Maker, but on branding was so continuity focused that many people couldn't tell if it was even a new system or just an add-on to the Wii. These are perhaps the two most dramatic cases of Nintendo falling on their face with innovation, but of course the nature of doing something new is that it does involve risk. Is Nintendo's appetite for risk somewhat diminished by its recent huge success? While I can see a case for that taking a short-term view, the long-term view is that Nintendo has won big far more often than it's lost by taking that very innovative cutting-edge approach. The risk Nintendo has is that there are only two real things it can offer gamers. It can't offer the best tech. That arms race was put to bed in the early noughties. It can't offer the best price. Large as Nintendo is, this is not a route they've ever wanted to entertain, and it's not a battle they are well provisioned to win. Nintendo's market capitalization is an incredibly respectable $73 billion, but Sony's is $120 billion and Microsoft's is $3.08 trillion. By dint of being less powerful, the Nintendo systems tend to be cheaper, but Nintendo can't guarantee that they will always be able to compete on price, and if Sony or Microsoft or even another competitor wanted to play rough, they would find it very difficult to keep their prices lower without digging into their considerable war chest. Also, Nintendo is oddly disadvantaged on games. Yes, they produce great games, but Sony and Microsoft are able to pitch to everyone else, and having a technological edge simply gives them more scope to bring in games from a greater variety of developers. So Nintendo has just two things going for it, but they are very big things. One is that their games are unique and generally of extremely high quality, but relying on quality is a risky strategy. When your lineup is Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Odyssey, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and Ring Fit Adventure, fair dues. There's a lot of variety and creativity and just general brilliance in that lineup. But when it's Zelda Skyward Sword, New Super Mario Bros. U, Nintendo Land and Sing Party, just to use some games from 2011 and 2012, well look, I know there'll be many people who can mount vigorous defences of those games, and there's a lot in there I like, but clearly these titles had certain flaws and certainly did not capture the imagination in the same way as the Switch lineup did. And then there's a second thing that Nintendo can offer, which is bold innovation, ideas that you cannot get anywhere else. The trouble is, this is a short-lived factor. Directional pads, shoulder buttons, analog sticks, touchscreen, motion controls, a hybrid form factor. All of these were aggressively new, at least in terms of the console space, when they arrived on the scene, but soon other people cottoned on and they ceased to be unique selling points for Nintendo. In some ways, Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is both a promise and a curse to them in terms of showing how the next system could go down. Now, I absolutely love Tears of the Kingdom, but it is very clearly positioned as a sequel, down to having the same world and the same graphical style as Breath of the Wild. It has some really innovative and brilliant ideas, but for whatever reason it doesn't appear to have been able to break out from the shadow of its illustrious predecessor. Pent-up demand from the 2017 release caused an absolute tsunami of early sales, but those who were lukewarm on the original didn't pick up the new one, it would seem, and it did not penetrate into a large enough number of new customers to keep inflating its numbers long term. If anything, people seem to continue to go for the original model for Breath of the Wild over Tears of the Kingdom. This is the risk that an iterative Switch 2 must face, even if it offers something completely new. If people can't see past the fact that it's another Switch, another of the same kind of machine they already own, it will only tap into the market of people who already really like a Switch and are really dedicated to the form factor. Now, the good news is that this is a very big market. The Switch still has a very decent shot at being the best-selling console in the history of the planet by the time the next few years are done. But it's very hard to claim to be both a sequel, playing steady as she goes, and doing something exciting and new. Even if the next system incorporates microphones, cameras, or any number of second-order improvements to the offer of the core system, that alone might not be enough to make it feel like a radical enough departure for people who are perfectly happy with their Nintendo Switch and its vast existing library of games. The GameCube is perhaps the archetypal example of what happens when Nintendo tries to accommodate itself too much to the prevailing gaming landscape. The decision to make the N64 cartridge base had meant they lost the Final Fantasy franchise, which was a huge deal even before Final Fantasy VII dropped, as Final Fantasy VI was also a pretty impressive game. But in retrospect, after Final Fantasy VII was such an absolutely explosive triumph for the PlayStation in 1997, the decision to go cartridge looked deeply flawed. So the GameCube had discs, albeit small ones, but then the storage limitation restricted them from having too much on there. Nintendo went for raw power, and that was all well and good, but how did they use this power? Titles like the cel-shaded style Wind Waker, a game and an art style I adored, but which was hardly the kind of utilization tech heads of the day may have had in mind. They worked on smaller changes to their form factor, and so we got the brilliant and to this day revered GameCube controller. It was their last traditional home controller, arguably the perfection of the form, but analog triggers didn't have the same kind of explosive push into the marketplace that the analog stick, motion controls or touchscreen. And perhaps an even more striking example of Nintendo being bound to do something by the competition is the Game Boy Color. Nintendo had 9.5 years to do the only decent thing and bring the much demanded Color Game Boy system to the market, and they responded with the Super Game Boy, allowing people to play Color Game Boy games on the Super Nintendo. Perhaps overly confident after the color-rich but battery-gluttonous Sega Game Gear fizzled slowly out, and after Pokemon Blue and Red revived the console's fortunes late in life, it's not clear that Nintendo would have gone for a color system at all if it were not for erstwhile Nintendo Genius Creative and Game Boy and Virtual Boy initiator Gunpei Yokoi and his color handheld, the Bandai WonderSwan, which promised to be the color Game Boy Nintendo remained intent on not providing. Of course, when Nintendo boshed their own color Game Boy into the market, it did very well, but lasted only a couple of years before they got to their true Game Boy sequel console. So I think by now we can see a pretty clear guide from Nintendo's history. They need to have a strong game lineup. They need to have a price that is not too low but not too high so it scares the market. They need to protect themselves against robust competition entering their space, which probably means having an innovative idea that is also highly successful. So how would a Switch successor disappointment go down? If they priced a little too aggressively from the start, let's say $500, this might hurt their sales into the second year, which could harm uptake of the system. At this point, developers of other high-end handhelds might be able to get a real toehold in the market if they launch at the right time and were able to run the Switch ragged. Nintendo has great games as a rule, but what if the next Mario game is great and all, but either slightly disappoints, a Sunshine-like case of being too tricky to control, or else not quite nailing the appeal that customers are looking for, or maybe just a 3D World-style case of being great at what it does, but not really capturing the imagination with something more ambitious? What if people look at the next Mario Kart and go, hey great, I have one just like that at home and it's got 96 tracks? What if people feel that Animal Crossing is a reminder of a time they don't really want to be reminded of, and so many do not return for the long-awaited sequel? And sure, there is a Zelda coming over the horizon, but the dev times on those games are getting ever longer, and for the power level of the next system, there is a very good chance it could be the next decade before the Hylian hero rises to action to save the day. Although Nintendo have afforded themselves a lot of time to keep these games in the oven by pushing the successor so late, and although they are expanding their game development arm aggressively, 4K games just take longer to make, and they don't have the Wii U to use as a poor pinata that they can whack every time they have a game drought. Now, to me, I think the fact that they will almost certainly have a new Mario and a new Mario Kart at or very soon after launch is putting the system much more into the Game Boy Advance category than the 3DS. A solid start that promises a bright future if they can keep that momentum going. But what really is going to mess things up is if their innovation goes wrong. If they take a big step forward, say a Switch VR, if it turns out that 3 decades on from the Virtual Boy, still nobody wants virtual reality, that could make people decide to twist rather than stick, and a new marketplace entrant could have a chance to steal Nintendo's lunch money. And yet, equally, having nothing major to announce might make them more secure for the next year or two, but it means the system will continue to be imitated and its market position chipped away at, so that by the end of the decade, when Nintendo still will be hoping to sell many of these consoles, the new system could start to feel like a disappointment, if only a relative disappointment. And then there is the competition. If Microsoft, for example, launched their own Xbox handheld, making a model of the system into something closer to the Switch in form factor, then the next system could find itself in a market dogfight again, just like the Sega Nintendo console wars of the early 1990s. Nintendo could have the best console in the world, but if the competition also has an amazing console that's in the same space, they are going to have to move the conversation onto other aspects of their product. My overall feeling is that it is innately hard to come up with something with really great, innovative, dial-moving ideas. Yes, motion controls, touchscreen and analog triggers work brilliantly, but then again, double-screen home gaming, stereoscopic 3D, and portable virtual reality clearly did not. It's a coin toss as to whether any major new tech jump might work. But then again, the company is exposed over the long term to the next system just being subtly but progressively elbowed out if it doesn't deliver. What is the greater risk? There is another option, and it's an option that we have already seen in this video. If Nintendo releases a Game Boy Advance style Switch iteration, solid, exciting, high selling, but not really the future, they can still keep a big, innovative idea in their back pocket. In this case, I think they would announce the system as a side system if they felt that the Switch sequel console wasn't quite punching at its weight. They did this with the DS when it launched, and even were hyping the Switch as a third pillar system, although that was a hard call when the Wii U had already crawled into the grave and started heaping earth onto itself before the Switch was even properly announced. If they're going to roll the dice on something risky, they can do it in their own time and put it alongside an existing solid option in the form of the great but steady as she goes Switch sequel system. If it turns out that their new venture is another DS and breaks out in a huge way, then great. If it turns out to be a Virtual Boy, then they still have a great system to fall back on, even if it's not exactly what they wanted. And it's crucial to remember that Nintendo's console output, while far and away their major ongoing concern, is not the only thing that they will be working on. Another 5 years would give them time to secure their footing in movies, to expand their current rather modest theme park offer, and to double down on their merchandising plans. Nintendo likes to innovate, but they also like to innovate from a place of safety. They kept the 3DS in new games for more than 2 years after the Switch came onto the scene, and they launched the DS at the height of the Game Boy Advance's power. A more tentative sequel console to the Nintendo Switch might be something they can cope with if they figure that it will still sell well for the first 4 or 5 years, because after that they could try transitioning to something else and still have a fairly strong backup plan in the form of the Switch Successor. After all, nobody expected the original Switch to last quite as long as it did, and although I am absolutely sure that Nintendo will want their next system to be another 8 or 9 year marathon success, as it provides stability and I'm sure becomes more profitable over time, they may feel that after 14 or 15 years of the same hybrid form factor that they're ready for an innovative departure, and if so, doing so in the middle of the Switch 2's lifespan might actually be the right time to open the floodgates on that blue ocean once again. Either way, Nintendo has many options to weather the storm if the next console is not as successful as they might hope, but they clearly want to sail into sunny waters if possible. A lot of this decides how risky they will choose to get with their console and whether they want an evolution or a revolution from the existing Switch, and this video here on screen has a more detailed deep dive on that front. Please do like, subscribe, share, comment and or check out the Patreon, but mostly please accept my grateful thanks for watching as ever, and I hope to see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.